The other half of that is recognizing each other's humanity. They don't see calling for the death of Jews as a moral bad because they don't see value in others' lives. America is based on, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator. That we have a mutual Creator, that we are divinely created, that I have self-worth, that I have worth, and you have worth.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for Off Limits Conversations, where I talk about all kinds of things that legacy media, mainstream media will not touch. Today, I'm talking with my friend, Rabbi Litvin. He's a rabbi in the University of Kentucky. He's a Chabad rabbi there. I met him when I went there for a speech last March. It's crazy. That's almost a year ago. And we're going to be talking about Israel, the disastrous hostage deal, anti-Semitism in the United States, and all the fight over cancel culture, free speech, all that kind of stuff. So I hope you enjoy it. Before we dive into the conversation, if you're watching this, please subscribe on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, X, or Twitter, or whatever you call it these days. And if you're listening on this podcast, please drop a 5-star review. It really helps me grow the podcast. Please enjoy the conversation. Rabbi Litvin, I know we've been talking for a long time about trying to set this up. We finally made it happen. So excited to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining me.
A pleasure to be here.
So we first met March of 2024 when I had the pleasure of coming to your college campus, University of Kentucky, where you're the rabbi there as one of many roles that you have. And the purpose was for me to come speak to some students with the Turning Point USA chapter about post-October 7th and what that means for Jews in America. So facing anti-Semitism, talking about Hamas in no uncertain terms, but really nothing that should be that controversial. And unfortunately, it went the way of quite a lot of these college speeches now, which is some rather unsavory characters started screaming at me saying I was pro the murder of babies, which is new to me, that everything I was talking about Hamas, which were direct sources from Hamas, by the way, complete lies. And we ended up having to have an armed escort, me and you and all the students who came, back to our cars, back to our dorm rooms. And the aftermath of these things, this happens to me, unfortunately, more often than not. But the focus is always on the speaker. And something I always try and do is point out that I get to leave, right? I drove home that night. I drove back to Nashville. I didn't have any ongoing problems. I leave all the problems behind me. And while I was getting, some of the interviews and some of the attention in the immediate aftermath, these problems are still ongoing, and they don't get the attention. They don't get the media coverage. They don't really get the outrage. So I wanted just to dive in and for you to give people a sense of what it is truly like on these campuses where it is in many ways not safe for Jews. It is not safe to be pro-Israel. It's not even safe to speak in any way in favor of Israel. So I'd love for you just to kind of rip the cover off and actually explain to people the true horrors a lot of Jews face on campus today.
So it's funny, you talk about you going home. Someone snapped a picture of me that evening. In the beginning, so first of all, the fact that your message was unoffensive and your message was a positive one, they would have no way of knowing because you had barely introduced yourself when they attempted to disrupt the speech. So how could they possibly know whether your message was offensive or not? They had zero interest in hearing it. But while they were yelling offensive slogans, and at first they were still trying to calm the room down, someone yelled that our tax dollars are paying for what's going on over there. So the fact that most of these kids, a lot of the leaders there are not American citizens and they're not paying taxes is a side issue with the president seems to have to deal with. We're speaking on January 29th. The president seems to have started dealing with this morning. Yep. But I had said back, thank you for your contribution, which I thought was an off-the-cuff funny remark. But she snapped a picture and she wrote, look at this horrible thing this guy wrote. This guy said to me. And she accurately quoted me, thank you for your contribution. And she put it out on Instagram and Twitter, and it was on all kinds of different pro-Hamas Twitter groups and WhatsApp groups and Facebook. And I found it hilarious. And then 2 weeks later, they tried to bring a pro-Hamas resolution to the city council in Louisville. And I registered to speak in defense of the Jewish people and morality in America. And they looked at the list of who was speaking, and they posted that picture. And they said, remember this guy, this evil guy that went to Ian's speech? Yeah, well, he's going to be here, and we need to show up. And I received death threats at that event for people who came to oppose me speaking because I came to hear you speak and had made this funny remark 2 weeks earlier. So I'm a professional. This is what I chose to do for a living. I chose to live in Lexington, Kentucky, where I'm in the extreme minority. I chose to represent morality and Judaism and the people of Israel on a campus where I am the only religious Jew, the only professional speaking about this.
Hmm.
We don't have another Jewish professional on campus who is willing to stand up against anti-Semitism, who was willing to stand up for Israel, etc. So that's something I signed up for. The students did not, as you said. And the students are one that have to live with this every single day. When there's a Hamas rally at the library, which part of their outrageous tuition that they pay is for access to this giant library, and Jewish students don't feel safe entering the
Hmm.
library. When Jewish students approach the library and get attacked, verbally or physically, that is a major problem, and that is something that we absolutely need to address.
How do you see us actually addressing that? Because I think there's obviously a big difference right now between Trump's America and Biden's America. And when I spoke at the University of Kentucky, it was obviously Biden's America. So there was an awful lot of Biden's America during an election too. So there was a lot of just ignoring this because they thought they needed the pro-Hamas vote, which quite literally blew up in their face, which is, glorious to watch. But in the long term, I feel like this is going to be one of those pendulum issues because obviously when there's not an ongoing conflict in the Middle East, it dies down a little bit. But anyone who's been following this more than 5 minutes knows that October 7th is particularly vicious in terms of the rhetoric going on. And it makes sense because what happened was particularly vicious. But this is a cycle. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. A lot of people on the outside of the issues of anti-Semitism and Israel and all these kind of things and Islamic terrorism, they forget that this is a cycle. A lot of the people in colleges now weren't even alive during 9/11. So do you see us making progress in this way, or do you think it's just a game of whack-a-mole, as it's been brought up before, where it's just we've got to be constantly fighting and never necessarily making progress, but keeping these things at bay?
I would note it's very hard to say this is entirely tied to wars in the Middle East because, and this is incredibly important to remember, these protests started before there was a war.
Hmm.
In Lexington, Kentucky, on October 7th, when we didn't know how many Jews were murdered in their beds, how many Jewish women were raped, how many Jewish children were kidnapped, they were already celebrating in downtown Lexington, students from the University of Kentucky, with posters with hang gliders on them. So these celebrations of terror and intents to frighten the Jewish community began before there was a war. And now that a ceasefire was forced upon Israel, I mean, calling it a ceasefire is a lie. It's a hostage ransom and a terrible capitulation to terror that I'm very embarrassed as an American that both the outgoing and ingoing administration supported this despicable deal. I think it is not coincidental that a week after the president very publicly celebrated this deal, the Taliban said, by the way, we're holding Americans. And they were shocked when America said that, that's despicable and that's wrong. And what do you mean? You just said people should pay ransoms for hostages. I absolutely think that not only is it disgusting because we're not standing by our allies in Israel, but when America supported this hostage deal, what they said was kidnap Americans. We're willing to pay hostages. We've moved from don't negotiate with terrorists to Monty Hall just yelling, let's make a deal. And if the going rate for a WNBA player is an arms dealer, what's the going rate for a teacher who was visiting Bulgaria? What's the going rate for a family? If the Bibas family were Americans, what would America be expected to pay to get them back? It was only 2 years ago in America that a terrorist went into a synagogue in Colleyville and believed by taking American Jews hostage, he could get American prisons to release terrorists. He thought the system that worked in Israel would work here. And it is our fault. So your first question of what can we do? The first question is we need to draw the line of what is right and what is wrong. We need, as a society, to say this is wrong. You just had a famous eatery in New York that was attacked. I believe it's called Miriam's. And you had a city councilwoman say this is so terrible and I love eating there. And oh, how could this happen in my community? And I'm like, sister, last week you were saying globalize the Intifada. This is globalizing the Intifada. You requested it, they fulfilled it, and now you're unhappy with the service. If you DoorDash Taco Bell and bad Mexican food shows up, you can't be upset. You're the one that did this. So it begins by recognizing that terms like globalize the intifada and from the river to the sea, they're not even good codes. It's not even a complicated code. We have to acknowledge what those mean, and that is not acceptable. Now, again, they are free to say it legally, but you should be shunned for the speech you use. When people say things that are wildly offensive, that offend our culture, that offend our sensibilities, we should make that known. And there are plenty of famous actors who say something offensive. There's no punishment from the state, but people say, I don't want to go to that guy's movies. When there was an actor last year who people thought was eating people. I'm a rabbi, I don't watch a lot of movies, I don't exactly understand that story. But people were like, yeah, that's messed up if he's eating people. Yeah, eating people is wrong. Calling for the murder of Jews in the streets of Manhattan is wrong. And you've seen it in the small term. Susan Sarandon, who's like 85 years old, is like, the reason I can't get jobs in Hollywood is because I support Gaza. I wish that was true. I really do wish. I'm like standing like Tyrion Lannister. I wish I was the monster you think I am. I wish that Guy Pearce is nominated for an Oscar for a role in which he plays where he assaults a Holocaust survivor. And he's so committed to his role of someone who assaults Holocaust survivors that he wears a Hamas pin on his lapel, celebrating people who right now are holding Shlomo Mansour, a Holocaust survivor. That's real commitment to a role. That's character acting. He's so committed to his role as someone who would assault a Holocaust survivor that he supports Hamas. So the idea that there are punishments in our society for holding these pernicious beliefs, I wish it were true, but it isn't. Now, on the other hand, if someone were to make that statement about other communities in America, they would rightfully be condemned. They would rightfully be isolated, and they should. That is a good thing to do. We should say, racists, we don't want you in our society. There was a guy that ran for Senate in a very, very conservative state a couple of years ago. But people looked at his record and the things he had said, particularly actions he had taken, people who didn't trust him around children, and they were like, no, we'll go with the liberal guy in this very conservative state because everything you represent makes us sick. This shouldn't be a Republican or Democrat issue.
It's the double standard, though, isn't it? I think this is what I always talk to when I try and talk to people who are non-Jews, who don't really understand anti-Semitism for a variety of understandable reasons. I think unless you're in the weeds of it, it's very easy to kind of dismiss it as quite a simple bigotry. But of course, it's not. It's very complex. It's very almost integral to a lot of European and Western history, for example. They don't understand the double standard element of it, which isn't just that you should... It's not that never criticize Israel or never criticize Jews or never have an opinion about Jews, which is obvious, usually what, the Dan Bilzerian, the Jake Shields of the world usually say is like, I can't even criticize Jews without being called anti-Semite. That's not true at all. It's what you say about Jews and what you say about other people who do the same or more, or what you don't say about those people. It's the issue. It's the double standard. I think that's what people need to understand first about anti-Semitism. Is that it's one thing to hold a standard for Jews. I don't really care what your standard for Jews is. But if your standard for Jews is an impossible standard and your standard for, say, Hamas is no standard at all, then I have a problem.
And yet, even when that happens, even when you have someone who is so blatantly anti-Semitic that, for example, they can't sit and watch a rabbi bless the United States of America during the inauguration, it makes them physically uncomfortable and they have to leave the room. When you have someone who's so such a delusional bigot that they can't just sit and grimace through it. There is no penalty for that. Mm-hmm. People still have. It's so funny to me to see a tweet by Dan Bilzerian, by Candace Owens, by Jake Shields with 13 million views. I was like, I'm being silenced for my views. Like, what are you talking about, buddy? What are you on about?
Worst censorship ever.
You're not being silenced. You're being celebrated. You're making money off that tweet. I know your name. I shouldn't know your name. You should be like every other racist who's yelling in a supermarket somewhere. I don't know who you are. So this idea that we silence people, not forget for criticism of Jews, for criticism of Israel, for outright, unquestionable anti-Semitism, they're still not silenced. There is no penalty in the United States for being an out-and-out bigot. The Council for American Islamic Relations is an unindicted co-conspirator with the Holy Lands Foundation. So not only did Biden just free the head of the Holy Lands Foundation, whose brother is currently the leader of Hamas, who was actually taking money from America and transferring it to terrorist groups whose mission calls for the murder of Americans as well as Jews. But you have an organization that sent money to enemies of America to attack America with, and they're welcomed into the president's office. They're seen when they made the national plan for anti-Semitism, they included CARE at that table. Like, did you need a professional anti-Semite's opinion? Well, you want to hear both sides out if you're fighting anti-Semitism. Like, it's so bizarre,
Yeah.
this accusation that, oh, if I say anything about Jews, I'm like, no, you can say globalize the Intifada. You can say murder Jews all around the world. And people are like, well, so I mean, the greatest example of that, there was a CNN conversation at that little round table they have, which they never invite me to. And Mehdi Hassan, who is an out-and-out anti-Semite and has been for years, who has said that anyone that isn't Muslim is a dog and that they don't have values. It just has made a career out of being a mouthpiece for terror. He said something about Jews, and another guest, Ryan, I don't remember Ryan's last name, made a joke about beepers. And they're like, well, we have to fire him. So this idea that there's this penalty in our society for anti-Semitism, there should be penalties. And again, and I want to be very, very clear about this, it is not the state that should take those penalties. It is we that should take that penalty. It used to be that if you said something, it wasn't that long ago that one of the stars of Seinfeld was at a comedy club making jokes, and he said something which clearly wasn't a joke. And suddenly he was persona non grata. Because someone who speaks that way, I don't want him as a guest on my show. I don't want him on my podcast. I don't want him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you have someone like Theo Vaughn, who will host within a month Bassem Youssef, or as I call him, Jihadi Stewart, and then 2 weeks later, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. The idea that you could have a platform that would give a Hamas mouthpiece a platform, and then the president, or at the time, a candidate for president of the United States, there is no penalty in our society for being that mouthpiece. The students on campus who are holding signs that say, kill the Jews, and who are threatening Jewish students, they don't do it hidden. Now, many of them will cover their face, but they do it because they know there won't be penalties. They're not concerned about the penalties. There was briefly an effort led by Bill Ackerman and others to say, we don't want to bring this hateful anti-American ideology into our businesses, so we don't want to hire these people. And they said, oh, so you're a racist. And it's like, why do you think that being an anti-Semite who hates America, there was a Borat went on Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, one of the Jimmys. And they all look the same and they're not funny, so it's hard for me to tell them apart. And Sacha Baron Cohen went on as Borat. And he says, and someone says, what, it's such a despicable anti-Islamic caricature. And I pointed out on Twitter, I said, he never mentions what religion he is. What you saw is someone who hates America, hates Jews, and beats his wife. And you thought they were characterizing you. That's a you problem.
Self-projection.
I have never thought that Borat is supposed to be a Haredi Jew. Because hating America, hating Jews, and beating women are not attributes I think of as my community. I'm like, the problem seems to be you. You think those are things that are staples of your community that are being ridiculed. So that's what it starts with. It starts with us actually fulfilling that promise. That not if someone criticizes a member of the Jewish community or not someone doesn't like a policy of Israel, but when someone can't sit through a rabbi praying for our nation, a prayer that honestly was very ecumenical, could have been made by a Catholic priest, could have been made by a different minister.
It was the most secular of all of them.
Yeah. It didn't mention Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It didn't mention Maimonides. It didn't mention the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who are the most common Jewish figures to be mentioned in prayers in the capital. It was a very ecumenical prayer. And if the fact that the guy is Jewish makes you so physically ill you have to leave the room, you should be rejected by American society. That's the first step.
I think there's a big problem as well in the aftermath of the cancel culture war. Because I think in quite a few years ago there was an issue from the left towards the right of cancel culture, where you said anything that should have been inside the Overton window, you were rejected. And the argument there is always cancel culture isn't always cancel culture. Like, there are some things where you should be shunned and some things you shouldn't. The debate is over what is valid and what is invalid. I think the problem I've seen now is you've seen a lot of people on the right who've made an entire business model out of intentionally trying to be cancelled, not being cancelled because now people have swung the other way and no one can be cancelled anymore, and then claiming to be victim, as you said, while raking in millions of dollars a year from social media views, from speeches, from events, from all kinds of things. And it's this weird self-victimization effort, which I see from the radical Muslim community too, of just claiming to be victims while being the obvious aggressors. I mean, we saw this to bring it back to the event I came to Kentucky to speak about. I was being yelled at. I was being called a genocidal murderer, while other people who were the ones yelling were the ones threatening. They were the ones following people back to their dorm rooms. They were the ones threatening people physically. It's a combination that, again, doesn't make sense, but seems to be dedicated to just the Jews and the Jews alone, where you can be both the victim and the aggressor and bounce between them and no one says anything.
So let me give you a couple examples of... No, I've never heard anyone say that the fact that Harvey Weinstein can't get a producer credit in Hollywood anymore is cancel culture. We all agree someone who did what he is accused of doing, what many people have credibly accused him of doing, doesn't get to work in Hollywood. We don't want to work with such a person. Yeah, that's fair. Very good. Jamal Bowman said the reason that I got fired from Congress is because I talked about the Jews. But here's the thing. Even though AIPAC did spend $16 million in his race, do you know how much that affected the polls?
Probably very little.
Less than 0.3%. It was a waste of money by them because they wanted to be on the winning side. They chose a race they knew was going to lose anyways. He lost because he's pulling fire alarms and yelling and screaming on the floor and embarrassing his community. It had nothing to do with Jews. And he's very happy to give a scapegoat. But the reason he was canceled, and he wasn't canceled, he's still a prominent leader in their party. I don't get why losers get jobs in politics. I think if you lose, you should go home. But he's still a prominent leader, but he lost his job because he's a buffoon, not because he's an anti-Semite. And then you look at someone like Shane Gillis. So Shane Gillis is a comedian. He got hired in one of the highest jobs a comedian can get. After he got hired, there was an immediate searching through everything he ever said in history. He had made a series of jokes that were offensive to some people, and he was immediately canceled. He was canceled before he even made it famous. I would argue today that Shane is more famous than anyone who's on SNL. But here's the key thing. He didn't get famous for the one joke that he got canceled for. He is a funny person who made an offensive joke that hurt people's feelings, but he's more famous, for example, for his Trump impression than anything else. And as far as I know, Trump is not yet a protected class that it's racist to make fun of him. He made jokes about this and made jokes about that, and that's why he's famous, because he's a genuinely funny person. He works in comedy where the job is to be funny, and he got famous again. He got over that hump. What's super disturbing to see is when people double down on the action that they think themselves is cancelable. You don't like me because I talk about the Jews. Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the Talmud. It's like that's your whole gimmick is talking about the Jews. You have nothing else to bring to the conversation. That's why people don't want to talk to you. So if I don't like Shane Gillis's joke about one community, he has hours of comedy that I could listen to about other subjects that don't have to be about that. When you have someone like Harvey Weinstein, his actions were specifically in the field he was in, so it taints it. And then you have someone who, although they have offensive views, that is not the reason they're removed from their position, like Jamal Bowman. Mm-hmm. So none of those are examples of cancel culture per se. So Shane temporarily was, but the reason he came back was not doubling down on the offensive statement he made. He just continued to make comedy. The big problem we see is that, so they're yelling and screaming that you're genocidal while calling for the murder of Jews. Yeah. One of the things I said as they were leaving and hounding students to their car, I kind of tried to take the attention more to me than to the students. And one of the things I yelled was Rafah now. Now, at the time, the American president was saying that if Israel invaded Rafah, millions would die. It would be a second and third Holocaust. It'd be the worst thing that ever happened in human history. I don't know if you've read the newspapers, but Israel went into Rafah. Most of the people who died were Hamas terrorists, including Yahya Sinwar, and hostages were rescued. So the horrible statement that I was making was the place where the terrorists are and the hostages are, Israel should go to rescue them. The statement they were making was kill all the Jews. And they honestly were saying my statement was more offensive than theirs. And the crazy part is that campus is playing along with this delusion.
Mm-hmm.
And when campus does that, it's very dangerous. They're hearing this from professors. There are professors at U of L, University of Louisville in Kentucky, University of Kentucky, Western Kentucky University, Northern Kentucky University, Eastern Kentucky University, Murray State, major universities in Kentucky where the professors themselves are spreading these hateful ideologies. So we are raising a generation of kids who hear this from their authority figures. It used to be that a campus was a place to hear opposing ideas. The last thing they wanted was to hear your view because they thought it might disagree with theirs. Again, they don't know what you were going to say.
Mm-hmm.
You said, hi, my name is, and like they didn't even get that far. So I think that's where it starts. The other half of that is recognizing each other's humanity. They don't see calling for the death of Jews as a moral bad because they don't see value in others' lives. America is based on, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator. That we have a mutual creator, that we are divinely created, that I have self-worth, that I have worth, and you have worth.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have worth in your name, but
I have extra worth.
Yeah, extra worth. But both of us have value. There's a silly dumbing down to a kindergarten level when people talk about violence in schools. So some violence in schools is caused by people like Candace Owens telling people that they are garbage and everyone else is garbage. And as you just saw in your home state, or your current state, your home state is like Bethenshire or something. I'm now going to be canceled in England. But often when you see violence, it's not because of some extremism from outside. It's because of lack of self-worth and lack of seeing the worth of others. When you start from a point that I am worthy and you are worthy, we're not NPCs. Each one of us is divinely created. Each one of us has value. God took the time to make us. The dumbing down kindergarten version of you took God out of schools and now there's violence paints God as this cartoon character from Family Guy with a big long beard and he's bald and he's yelling and screaming and throwing lightning bolts. That's Zeus. That's not God. That God that people don't believe in, I also don't believe in. But the God that I believe in teaches me I have value and you have value. And when you remove that lesson, the lesson of each one of us being worthy, each one of us having value, then why shouldn't I commit an act of violence? What does it harm? Just like when I'm angry, I might throw something against a wall. Why shouldn't I harm a classmate to express myself? He has no value. I have no value. That's the danger of removing morality from society. And in current American elitism, they believe that academia saves us from that. But the most educated country in history was 1930s Germany. Justice Anton Scalia spoke about this at length in a particularly stirring way about how art and culture and music were all in their heyday in Berlin. Berlin was the most educated and cultured place in the world, and the greatest evil happened there. Lubavitcher Rebbe, my personal mentor and the foremost Jewish leader of the modern era, explained why that is. He said, education without morals has no value. When you remove the morals from the education, when you take away why we want to get educated, why we want to improve the world, why we want to contribute, When you're just building, you can build anything. You can use those building blocks to make anything. You could take something which could be a tremendous good and instead use it for tremendous evil. And those are two ways that we are massively failing our young people right now.
Mm-hmm. I think you hit the nail on the head with the failure in academia as well, in the not seeing the humanity in each other, because we see it beyond academia. We see it when you see anyone you dislike and just calling them a Nazi. And guess what? Calling Donald Trump a Nazi for 8 more years, someone tried to kill him, because that's what you do with Nazis. It's all the same problem. It's all just, I think, diluting people down to good and bad, not me, therefore they're wrong. And I think, as you say, it all starts in academia. But my question is always, how do we fix this? Like you are in an academic bubble. You see students dealing with this. You're seeing it not just across the state of Kentucky, but across the country. You've been in many other countries as well. You know, this is an international problem. How do you see us solving this problem of radicalization in college campuses, of not seeing common humanity in each other, not encouraging people to actually question thought and build their own sense of moral worth? It's one thing to point out the problem. I think you did it excellently. How do we actually move forward and solve the problem, or do you think we even can?
So when I was 25, I was newly married. I had just opened a Jewish Student Center at the University of Kentucky, and I went on vacation for 3 days, and I came back home to 4 inches of water in my basement. And a bunch of stuff from our storeroom ruined. I'm standing in this water, and I call my brother, and I'm just freaking out. I'm thinking all of our records are ruined. My baby picture, like all these stuff we have are ruined, and the carpet's ruined, and we have classes down here. And I call my brother, I'm like, what do I do? What do I do? He goes, the first thing you do is you turn off the water. You actively stop the flooding. Then we can talk about other things. But right now, you need to turn off the water. So I think the first thing we need to do as we talk about how to fix this problem is stop the flood. And that starts from grade school. There's right now a bill here in Kentucky to create a moment of silence in schools, in grade schools, before they start the day. A chance to give students a moment to think of their own self-worth and their classmates, to look around the room. The law very specifically says a teacher should not lead prayer during that time, shouldn't even tell the kids what to be thinking about. Mm-hmm. And if the kid doesn't know what to think about, the teacher should tell them, ask your parents. And that could start a very powerful conversation at home as well. But that idea that I should take a minute to reflect, why am I in school? I came here for 8 hours today. Why did I come here? What am I trying to get out of this experience? What is my role in this experience and in this culture? So it starts by not allowing more generations to do this. Turn off the flood, because otherwise you're going to drown. Once we put effort into that, the second thing is, what do we do on campuses today? And what it requires is a massive assault on modern academia. There's something remarkable happened in Israel. And I think we're seeing a reflection of that now in America. In the 1970s and 80s, there was, throughout the 1970s, there was frequent fighting back and forth up until, 60s and 70s, I'm sorry, up until 1973 in the Yom Kippur War, when Israel won a resounding victory. And with the exception of the Arabs living in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, who are in a cult of hate which hasn't allowed them to recognize their own defeat, Egypt realized they weren't going to win this war, something they didn't realize in 48, something they didn't realize in 67. And from 1973 on, there was no war with Egypt. The same thing with Jordan and Syria and Lebanon. The Arab world realized their dream of a second Holocaust wasn't going to happen by military might. And then several years later, Israel was pushed into making horrible concessions for a piece of paper that said peace on it, even though they had already won the peace. So a idea was presented, something that has never worked in human history, of trading land for a promise of peace. And it became the accepted truth. The only way the Jews are going to be worthy of peace is if they give up enough land to give them indefensible borders, to give up their holiest sites, to give up their heritage, to give up the land they are indigenous to, that they're spiritually connected to. And in exchange, they get a promise of peace. And that became the political truth. And for a long time in Israeli academia, if you would publish an article saying that Camp David was a great idea, that giving away all of their oil and giving away 60% of the land they controlled was a good idea, that Anwar Sadat wanted peace with Israel, that Hosni Mubarak was a peace-loving person who just wanted to live happily alongside, and that if you do the same thing in each country, then it's a wonderful thing, that we should give the Temple Mount to Jordan, that we should give away the land that we liberated in 67, the lands of Yehud and Shomron, the lands of Hebron, the oldest Jewish city in the world, of Shechem, where Joseph is buried, of Beis Lechem, where our mother Rachel is buried. Lands that not only are Jewish in our scripture, but if you've ever read the Bible, the most dominant religion in the world, very much talks about these being Jewish lands. If we give that up, then we'll finally be deserving of peace. Now, if you wrote an article that supported that, that article would be widely published. It would be praised. It would go in the greatest academic journals. But if you were to point out, this has never worked before, there is no concession you can give radical terrorists who all they want to do is murder, that will satisfy them. There was a cartoon during the Obama administration with a Hamas leader opposite Bibi with John Kerry standing in the middle. And the Hamas leader is holding up a demand that says, kill all the Jews. And John Kerry says, can't you meet him halfway?
Yeah.
So it's funny, but it's unfortunately a very, very accurate perspective of how John Kerry thought. I think one of the funniest videos in politics is John Kerry wagging his finger as he says there will never be what we would call now the Abraham Accords. It'll never, 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 never. And it's just so funny how the buffoonery of the State Department, which magically is always wrong. A broken clock is right twice a day. The State Department has never gotten anything wrong, never gotten anything right, ever. And that's impressive. Yeah. In the recent war in Ukraine, the State Department said, number one, Putin will never invade. Number two, if he would, which isn't going to happen, he would win an instant victory within 24 hours. I don't know if you're aware of the news, but Russia did invade and they didn't have an instant victory. I know, shocking. And we actually see that every single Secretary of State has been less informed when they were finished being Secretary of State than when they started. There's a Adam Sandler movie where the guy says, everyone here is now dumber for having heard what you have to say. That literally happens in the State Department. Secretaries of State are dumber when they leave the State Department than when they enter. And so this idea that the only path to peace is making horrible concessions to terrorists was the truth. So if a professor wrote that, they would get published. Mm-hmm. Publishing is a major part of what gets your advancement in academia. So what we end up with today is the leading academics in Israel are all people, universally, who were entirely wrong historically. And the people who were right, the people that said something like October 7th would happen, are isolated. They're associate professors somewhere. They don't have leading positions because they were never published, because their opinion was, through academia, considered to be wrong and foolish and perhaps even morally wrong. So they've built a self-contained bubble, which the wrong opinion exclusively was promoted, which now leads to a position where if you want the approval of the leading professors, you need to be wrong. And they have spent their entire career being wrong. So they either have to acknowledge they've been wrong the entire time or double down. And we're seeing the same thing here in America now, where
always doubling down.
Academia has uplifted one opinion and pushed away another, have self-selected which opinions are right, and if you want approval from higher professors today, so you have something like the Academy of Pediatricians of America or something I think it was called, wrote a letter supporting a Hamas colonel, that he should be freed. And it's like, have you ever written a letter about any international incident ever? Mm-hmm. In the 80 years of you? No. This is the one time. Sure, because if you're not willing to sign this letter against the Jews, you are excluded from our circles. This is the opinion you have to be accepted. And that's what students are being told. I have students who are pro-Israel who would never bring that up. Are you crazy? Mm-hmm. When he's still controlling my grade? So what that ends up with is an echo chamber where I honestly believe that if a student went to a political science class at the University of Kentucky and during discussion said, I think we should kill all the Jews in the world, the professor wouldn't say that view is evil. they would say it's a little too extreme. Slow down, slow down. All the Jews. I mean, most of the Jews, sure, but all of them? I have a friend who's Jewish. He's cool. Just everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and why? The reason those extremist opinions can find root on campus is because the other side has been eliminated. Jews who are proud of their Judaism have been eliminated to such an extent that it's not even part of the conversation anymore. So the debate becomes between, should we kill all the Jews or should we only kill half the Jews?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the two opinions that are left. And they present them as if it is two opinions. If that's the two sides of this discussion.
It's absolutely crazy. I think this is a really good segue actually into what we were going to talk about as well, as the horrendous hostage deal that I think caused a lot of distress and anger amongst Jews, at least across America. And the idea that it's based on this strange naivety of, if we just, this one last deal, just this last little step, this last little concession, that'll give peace. And some of the Israelis I've spoken with, their perspective is always, that's just part of the game. We've got to keep making these concessions because getting people back in the here and now is the most important part. And a concern I've had is it's kind of like the equivalent of the economic argument of, if you only focus on the positive of your policy and ignore all of the negatives that will never happen as a result, that will happen as a result, and you ignore all of the positives that would have happened if you did nothing, if you did something else. That's what's happening with this hostage deal, because yes, it's obviously fantastic. Every individual that is held hostage, we should be able to try and get them out alive if possible. It is incumbent, I think, on the Israeli military to do that, because that is their role. That is the role of any sovereign nation, is to protect their own citizens. But no one's thinking about the future hostages or the future victims of the people who will be released in return, of the terrorists who are being let out of prisons as we speak. Dozens in return for, in some cases, a single dead hostage. No one is speaking for those people. I think it kind of loops into the same naivety of making these concessions for the here and now, as if that's one last trick to the puzzle and then everything's fine, when it's just kicking the can down the road. And then the future victims, no one speaks for them until it's too late. So first, I would love to hear your thoughts just on this deal a bit more deeply. I think we're on the same page in that it's horrendous. But also, how do we change that? Because I feel like I was so excited about the Trump administration in many ways, but one of them was going to be foreign policy. And then the celebration of this deal compared to what the Abraham Accords achieved, it didn't make sense in my mind. I think a lot of it was PR based, of just, look, I've got this great, wonderful deal. But the deal is horrendous. And I think if that is where American policy is going to go on this front, it's not going to be great. So, yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this horrendous hostage deal.
So first of all, the idea that an American envoy showed up in Israel on Shabbos, on the Jewish day of rest, which is, the Israeli government has Jewish aspects, and demanded to meet with the prime minister. And when told the prime minister doesn't do official meetings on Shabbos, as a matter of policy, he said, I don't give a crap about your Sabbath. If an American ambassador did that in Saudi Arabia, that is all the American press would talk about for the next month. I haven't seen a single American media group talk about that. So I am not going to say here publicly in front of everyone that Steve Witkoff is an American traitor who is in the pocket of Qatar, and that the $30 million he bundled together for the Trump campaign, which resulted in getting this envoyship, was to protect his $640 million investment with Qatar. I'm not going to say that, but it's all true. So we have here an envoy who bought his position seemingly to protect a much larger investment with Qatar, who is Hamas's backer, along with Iran. The idea that Qatar is doing God's work, as the American envoy Steve Witkoff said, is a lie.
Yeah,
that he
disgusting lie.
That is something that has no basis in reality. Now let's talk about the deal that he forced through. Now, on the one hand, I have never worn jewelry before in my life, but I'm wearing a necklace today. The necklace says, Halev sheli shuvi ba'aza, that my heart is imprisoned in Gaza. And I wear it because it's true. There is no one other than the families who celebrates the release of these hostages more than me and every other Jew in the world. I certainly understand the desperation of the families to rescue their family members. But I'm an American. I was raised in America. And I wasn't raised in the America of 2025. I was raised in America in the 80s and 90s. Hijackings were not unusual in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
The Italian Red Army or the IRA, all these different evil groups would take over a plane and would trade that plane back to a European country in exchange for the release of terrorists. And it was like a normal thing. But they did it in Europe. And here's what would happen in a fictitious case where, let's say, Italian red terrorists take over a plane. And they go through, where are you from? England. Where are you from? Italy. Where are you from? Spain. They get to the last row. And they say, and where are you from? And the guy looks up and says, America. And a, oh, what have I done expression washes over the terrorist's face. And suddenly the plane is shrouded in mist. And out of the mist rises a helicopter that wasn't there before. And leading off the helicopter are Navy SEALs. And out of nowhere, even though Bluetooth hadn't been invented yet, Fortunate Son starts playing. Ta-da! And it's over. That is what America did. You took one of ours? It's over for you. Mm-hmm. What a horrible mistake you've made by kidnapping an American. You must not know who we are. There's a movie that was very popular a couple of years ago about the kidnapping of Captain Phillips. And everyone remembers the scene where a brilliant actor who's playing a Somali pirate says, I'm the captain now. Yeah, he took over the ship. Do you know how that story ends? Mm-hmm. That story ends with him dead in a boat and all of his friends dead. Because that's what happens when you kidnap an American. You die and all your friends die. And that's why it's great to be an American. We are the greatest country in the world. Sadly, that seems incredibly removed from where we are today. It's worth noting that for the last 450 days, not just Israelis have been held, mm-hmm. Americans have been held. Yep. While America seemingly did nothing about it except fund the people holding those terrorists, holding those hostages. Aside from my concern as a Jew, as an American, it's horribly embarrassing. That's not who we are as a nation. Mm-hmm. So it's one thing when a foreign government imprisons someone for a crime. So you had the Brittany Griner case, where an American citizen was in a foreign country and committed a crime. Was the punishment draconian and wildly inappropriate for the crime committed? Yes. But they had an excuse for why they were holding her. Yep. And so we ransomed her back. We traded her for an international terrorist who later helped aid the war in Ukraine. I know in the weeks after she returned, her doctor said that she couldn't be around any excitement or any crowds. So she exclusively went to WNBA games. But there was an American who was being held, and we freed that American. That's one thing. You have similar in North Korea where they imprison people for espionage. They don't say we're holding them because they're Americans. Mm-hmm. That is what they're doing. But they have that veneer that they hide behind. Well, we think he's guilty of espionage. Okay, Iran does the same thing. Iran is currently holding an American school teacher. Russia is currently holding an American school teacher. But again, they have trumped up charges. Hamas didn't use that veneer. Hamas invaded Israel and kidnapped American citizens. And America's like, yeah, we don't like that. That's not great. I will note that John Kirby, who was a spokesman for the State Department, wore this necklace every single day during his presentation and never forgot the American hostages. And I admire him tremendously for that. But you did not see that in American foreign policy. Mm-hmm. America did not initiate a single condemnation of it in the UN. Even in the halls of uselessness, we didn't say they've taken our citizens and this is wrong. And this goes to the greater issue of why we all have a need to fight anti-Semitism. Because what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. Tomorrow, they're releasing 2 Jews. And they're releasing 4 Thai workers who are not Jewish, who aren't friends with Jews, who don't... They were working on a kibbutz there. And they were kidnapped and their friends were beheaded. for existing, for living in a free country. Because what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. Even if you don't have morality and you don't care what happens to the Jews, when you allow these things to take place, it does not end with the Jews. When students took over Columbia University, they didn't assault a Jew. They assaulted an immigrant janitor who was trying to clean the library. That's who saw violence as a result of their hatred of Jews. They assault police officers, not Jewish police officers, American police officers. So the idea that we are paying a hostage deal is despicable. I understand the desperation of the families. I don't blame the families at all.
Yep.
There's a reason it's not the families who make these decisions. There's a reason that if the best surgeon in the world, the best neurosurgeon in the world, had a child who had needed to have neurosurgery, they are not allowed to provide that surgery. It is against the law for them to provide that surgery, and if they provided that surgery, they would lose their license. Because we don't let you treat your own kids. Because you shouldn't be the decision maker in this situation. You should be emotional. You should be willing to do anything to save your child. That is your job as a parent. But the Western world is supposed to look out for those children and all other children. So aside from the fact that it is absolutely shameful, both on Israel's front and on America's front, that I had to say the words Rafah now, that we didn't immediately go into Rafah, when we knew that's where Sinwar was, when we knew that's where hostages were. The fact that America postured about, oh, well, war is bad. Yeah, war is bad, and you shouldn't have started one. We should have been at Rafah immediately. And I don't know how many more hostages would have been rescued and would we still be alive today if we had done that. There's no way to possibly know that. But I do know that there were dozens of hostages in Rafah. I do know the war was being fought by Mohammed Dayef, by Sinwar, by Abu Ubaidah from Rafah. So not only, before we made this horrible deal, we were fighting with one hand behind our back. And when I say, I mean the Western world. Because again, these hostages were from many countries. We're fighting with one hand behind our back. We were making Israel fight this battle, and we were holding them back from actually doing it. But the thing is that making poor decisions is one thing. But as the famous expression goes that there is no proof that Einstein ever said, insanity is trying the same thing again and again and expecting different results. We tried this when the PLO was in Lebanon. Let's find a way to make peace. We'll trade you back your people. And every one of those people returned to terror. I celebrated when Gilad Shalit came home. I celebrated when he got engaged. I feel connected to Gilad, who was a young man who was kidnapped by Hamas. But among the 1,000 terrorists they released in exchange for his life was Yahya Sinwar, who went on to plan and execute October 7th. Let us be very clear. Without the Gilad Shalit deal, October 7th could not have happened logistically and would not have happened ideologically, because Sinwar learnt Israel will pay hostages. If not for the Camp David Accords, in which they gave away 60% of their land, the entire Sinai to Egypt, the open road going through the corridor into Gaza, where weapons are smuggled in every day, would not be open, because we would control that area. We wouldn't have had to fight to control that corridor months into the war. We would have controlled it, because we would control the area between Gaza and Egypt. It is directly because of that logistically it happened, and ideologically, that precedent we set, that we will exchange a promise in exchange for land, is the precedent that gave the Arabs Gaza and gave Hamas the ability to attack from Gaza. So both ideologically and logistically, these are a huge setback. Now, we could talk at length about the concept of a hudna, that ideologically, from Hamas's perspective, from the radical Islamist perspective, they have this concept dating back throughout their entire culture of making a temporary peace with the intention of murdering you in your week. It is written in their holy books that one should do such a thing, and they did it multiple times throughout history, particularly against not Jews but Europeans, signing a 10-year truce and attacking after 3 years, etc. But more than that, if you want to step away from this conversation entirely, look at Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, you had the Tamil Tigers. The Tamil Tigers were fighting for a free and independent Tamil. And why not? The right to self-determination belongs to all people, regardless of their perspective and their ideologies, which is foolishness. It's simply not true. Spain doesn't give self-determination to the Basque people. Italy doesn't give self-determination to the various groups that want self-determination there. There is no country in the world that is set to the standard that we set for Israel, that this invented people that never existed in history now have the right to self-determination. Mm-hmm. If you look at Sri Lanka, what happened is the Tamil Tigers would attack the Sri Lankan military. Then the Sri Lankan military would respond. They would go to the UN and go, look, they're hurting us. And the UN would tell Sri Lanka, back up. And this continued until one time Sri Lanka said, no, I can't do this anymore. And there is no threat from the Tamil Tigers anymore. We haven't heard of the Tamil Tigers in 20 years. Because the idea that you can't militarily beat an ideology is a stupid lie. We have done it numerous times. It is through our efforts funding the Mujahideen, it is through our efforts in Korea and Vietnam that we beat socialism. And are there still socialists in Russia today? Yes. But the USSR, which was formerly a source of evil across the entire world, collapsed. Nazism was an evil ideology. Are there still neo-Nazis today? Sure. But Candace Owens and Jake Shields, as many followers as they have, don't have the risk of conquering Europe. I don't mind if you yell in your basement about how much you hate the Jews. Do whatever you want. It's when that turns to violence and political power it's a problem. We did beat the Nazi ideology. Again, you still have David Irving, who's a Nazi living in England. You still have a march in Charlottesville. If you remember, about 8 years ago now, when there was a march in Charlottesville, and it was the worst white supremacist march in America, it was 300 people from across the country. That is not a threat. In Kentucky, the Ku Klux Klan just put out a press release that they are a rising force in Kentucky. I'm like, buddy, if you're the one that has to put out the press release, it's not true. If the FBI puts out a press release that you're a rising strength, oh, okay, like what a loser has to put out I just recently put out a press release about how tall and handsome I am, just for people to know. Like, that doesn't get us anywhere. So the Klan is a joke. It is a shadow of its former self, and that's a wonderful thing. But them putting out press releases, they're resurging. The amount of media attention given to 300 people marching in Charlottesville was so ridiculous because they didn't matter. And it was only because of the vast media attention that led to a counter-protest, that led to violence where tragically a woman was murdered. I don't know if that would have happened if the entire media hadn't decided to focus on 300 losers who were embarrassed to show their faces marching in Charlottesville.
Again, though, that comes down to the narrative being pushed of it's not about the fact that they're Nazis or white supremacists or anything. It's about maligning every conservative in America or every Republican with those people. That's the only reason that they're attention, and there's no real attention given to the people waving Hamas flags and screaming for the death of Jews or the death of the West or death of America.
So, yeah, we certainly want to talk about the 50,000 people showing up in London outside synagogues. And when the government says that you can't go outside a synagogue and threaten to murder Jews, the head of the Islamic Society said that it's an Islamophobic law.
But also you've got people who are politically abusing Western tolerance to their own intolerant gains. And it's the naivety of the West that just sees this happening and happily climbs into the wolf's mouth and thinks they're going to go for a nice nap. It's insane.
100%. So we have seen what happens. We have seen what happens when we don't give in to terrorists. Sri Lanka is a perfect example. There is no threat of Tamil Tigers anymore. And we've seen what happens when we do negotiate with terrorists, when we do sign these deals. And what happens is October 7th. So the idea that anyone would support this deal from a political standpoint, again, this does not apply to the families. This does not apply to the emotional argument that we need to bring them home, because there is no answer to that emotional argument. Mm-hmm. But it is not the government's job to be emotional. It's the government's primary job. And I understand that people think government should be doing anything and everything, but a government's primary job is to protect its citizens from threats, foreign and domestic. That is the purpose of a federal government, period. To protect its citizens from foreign threats. The Torah gives an example of bad leadership and good leadership in the same portion. In the portion of Balak, you have a king of Moab, Balak, who sees the Jews coming, and for no reason, they haven't threatened or anything, decides it's a threat, and immediately announces, we're under threat, the sky is falling, what should we do, what should we do? He is afraid, and he immediately shares that with his people. That is bad leadership. Later in that portion, you have a warlord, Og Melech of Bashan, who attacks the Israelites with a giant army. And it says Moses was afraid and he spoke to God. When a good leader is afraid, he works that out with his creator. When a bad leader is afraid, he spreads that fear to his people. A good leader says, how can I protect my people? Not how can my people protect me? Mm-hmm. So a government's primary job is protecting the people. There is no one who is honest and who has an IQ above room temperature who could look someone in the eye and answer this question. Does this deal make Israel more safe or less safe? There is no one who honestly believes the answer to that is yes.
So one last question I had for you before we wrap things up, Rabbi Litvin, is a lot of focus in Israel, but across the world, is on the Bibas children. And I think they've become an image of the innocence of all of the hostages, and I think correctly so. The idea that you can take babies hostages, let alone the children who were murdered on October 7th, says everything about Hamas. And I think the fact that Hamas is still seen as anything other than bloodthirsty evil terrorists says a lot about the world. With Hamas right now, they're not releasing who is alive and who is dead, but they've said that at least 8 of, I think, the 26 remaining hostages to be released are dead. Do you think that, God forbid, if these children and the family has been killed, which unfortunately they probably have at this point, do you think that will change the view towards the emotional view of we must get the hostages out at any cost? Do you think that will change the view there? Or do you think the idea that we just must get the hostages out will remain? I know it's a difficult question, but I think my problem with a lot of these things is that is the root of the whole idea of taking hostages, right? Is that if you can do that and still play ball, then I think it leaves you open to further victimization, that if we don't actually address the reality of the situation, we're doing a disservice to our future selves. So where do you think this is going if worst comes to worst, we do hear this horrific news?
So as a matter of Jewish law, until I have verifiable proof that a Jew has been killed, I assume that Jew is alive. It is my fervent prayer and hope that the Bibas children will be returned to us. But yes, the Bibas children don't only point out that kidnapping them was an evil act with no justification, but Shlomo Mansour was an evil act with no justification. Emily Demiri, who the first time your nation's press ever mentioned her was when she was freed. The British press ignored when a British citizen was being held for over a year. Only when she was freed, they're like, oh, by the way, look at that, she's British. Oh, who could have seen that coming? So they very much represented the innocence of all the hostages. But, number one, the desire for families, for the hostages to come home, doesn't change based on logic or logistics. So if you have Father A and Father A's daughter is being held right now, the fact that another hostage was killed doesn't change his overwhelming need to embrace his daughter, to bring her home at any cost. So for him, the perspective doesn't change. For a lot of the political people behind the Bring Them Home movement, I'll be a little callous here, it's not about the hostages for them. It's bringing down the current government, which is something they have pledged their lives to for the last 15 years. So regardless of how many hostages come home, regardless if each and every one of the hostages came home tomorrow, you hear, Ken Yeretson may be God's will, they would still be demanding that the government is evil and the government needs to do whatever. And as for the government and the Western world, I make no assumptions that these children's lives are not 100% healthy. But what would 2 more babies change that throwing babies in ovens on October 7th didn't change? That beheading a child on October 7th didn't change? That murdering kids on the beach didn't change? What could possibly 2 more deaths change? Because you knew these kids beforehand? I feel like I know these 2 kids. I have pictures of them in my home. But from America's perspective, from the Israeli government's perspective, what would this change? You know who these people are. You know they worship death and evil. You know there is no good in their ideology. You know, their entire desire for statehood, as they have openly said, is to murder Jews, all Jews. When Kfir Bibas was born in a little Israeli town, Hamas already wanted to murder him. When Ariel Bibas was born, when Yarden Bibas was born, 36 years ago, they wanted to murder him. From the very birth of a Jew, he is on their list. As Nasrallah, may he rot in whatever place God deigns to put him. Do you know that when Nasrallah died, he died choking on his own acids under a pile of rocks? He didn't die in the bombing. He died in agony, covered in stones, looking at his daughter's dead body, which brings me a little bit of solace, but not enough. I just like saying that out loud. And Nasrallah said he wants every Jew in the world to move to Israel so he can kill them all in one place. He's talking about my kids. He's talking about your parents. He's talking about everyone. So, unfortunately, I will not give a for instance with these children, but if a family called the Cohens were kidnapped and the entire family was annihilated by Hamas, I don't think it would change politics a single bit, unfortunately, because this isn't based in logic and isn't based in morals. It's capitulation to evil, and the arguments for capitulation, the arguments for it is easier, it is more politically expedient to end this. I want to have a one-line throwaway in my first speech that said I brought peace, so I'm willing to force you to capitulate in any way possible, doesn't change with the murder of 2 or 3 more people, unfortunately.
I can't believe that this is the conversation we're having, but it's the reality of the world we live in, unfortunately. I think we're going to have to leave it there. Rabbi Litvin, thank you so much for joining me. It's an absolute pleasure to finally have this conversation. I want to have you back on the show. I think there's so much more we need to talk about and dig into. Before you leave, I would love for you just to share where people can follow you and follow your work and just your guidance. I think you've been a tremendous resource for me in the last almost a year since we met. So I would love for people to be able to find you online and follow you and support you.
So as long as TikTok still exists, legally in America, it shouldn't. I don't quite understand how it does, but I'm on TikTok. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter as @BluegrassRabbi. I'm very easy to find online, searching my name, Rabbi Litvin, or @BluegrassRabbi. You can find me on Red Note as All Hail the Supreme Leader and Glorious King. I'm not on Red Note because I'm not a supporter of the CCP, which is an evil force in the world and responsible for the death of hundreds of millions. So I'm on most social media at Bluegrass Rabbi, and I'm at the Chabad House in Lexington, Kentucky, at the University of Kentucky. Come on by, grab a coffee, and let's talk.